Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today is going to be an episode talking about a growing sense of anger, resentment, distrust, and even paranoia in the population. And when I say population, I say that because I don't think it's unique to the states where I am based out of. I think it's something that's happening globally. And I don't think it's any coincidence, we'll kind of get to this, that there's sort of a rise in more nationalistic and dictator-like mentalities across the globe as well. Again, we'll get into that a little bit. At the end of the day, the spoiler alert here is that underneath anger and distrust is fear. A lot of folks in a position of distrust or they're feeling angry don't like to hear that, right? Talk to somebody who's angry, be like, actually, you're really just afraid in this moment. They will show their middle finger to you, if not some other unkind words alongside that. So bear with me. I understand that might be sound a little audacious for me to claim, but I do believe it to be the truth, that at the core, think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, that fear and anxiety motivate us towards self-preservation, which is what anger and aggression is, and as well as like distrust. Distrust is protective and adaptive. If something is unfamiliar or untried, we need to be cautious because it could potentially hurt us. The trick, though, is often we experience these emotions towards things and towards circumstances that don't necessarily merit that type of anger or distrust. The way I'm going to talk about this is first talking about paranoia, but including a personality lens of how fear and anxiety translates into paranoid thought. And it exists on a continuum, that the distrust often is what sets in first, and then paranoia grows from that. And similarly, we'll talk a little bit about anger and resentment and aggression that can come as well. And particularly challenging is when those two worlds meet. When paranoia meets with anger. It gets us into a dangerous position, not just as an individual, but as a society. Now I'll talk a little bit about implications, so what does any of this mean and what might we do about it? I'm not going to have grand answers here. There's going to be a lot more questions, I think, in today's episode than answers, but hopefully just helpful or curious food for thought. So let's start with paranoid personalities. Now there is a diagnostic category for this, but I'm not talking through diagnostic lens. Remember, if you haven't seen my personality-based episodes, I will talk a lot about that all of this exists on a continuum, and it almost always includes the normal range too. A perfect example, I think, that most people can identify with is in my narcissism episode. I say everybody's got a narcissistic defense. Well, guess what? Everybody's got paranoia in them too. But let's start with how can paranoia develop? From a disorder, a personality disorder lens, what psychodynamic folks say is it's that typical nature and nurture. Underneath the surface, the nature of it all, the genetics and temperament suggests that these individuals might have a low frustration tolerance, that there isn't just a sensitivity with a lot of feedback, because that's the origin of a lot of personality-related difficulties is a heightened sensitivity, but this lowered frustration tolerance that can lend itself towards a more irritable and frustrated sort of response with the world at large. And then you mix that on the nurture side, the environmental side, as lots of invalidation, shame, and guilt-based environments don't help with this because it puts the human being on the defense. Because their experience, their mindset is frequently, if not constantly, being delegitimized, that the world becomes this aggressor that's constantly challenging them. And thereby, one way to cope with it, other than getting depressed and anxious, is to become a bit paranoid and project that stuff out, which we'll talk about. Now, if you're sitting there going that sounds really unhealthy, I don't think I'm prone to that. I'd say, au contraire, let me give my example. So let's say that you have something bad happen to you. Some random event, and it happens over here. Let's put it on the alphabet, right? This is F, point F. Very natural for human beings to look at circumstances, often in retrospect, because we're not constantly analyzing our environment, but when something big happens, very natural, very adaptive to look back and go, whoa, how'd I get to point F? Now, sometimes we'll do a really good job at this and we'll look back, there's good information, or there's lots of folks that we can collaborate with to help us arrive upon some semblance of a truth. Remembering that there's very few absolute truths in this world, but a general, kind of objectively understood, like, that's how I got from A to F. Cool, that's informative. But quite frequently in this somewhat chaotic world, we won't have all the letters. A, B, C, D, E, F, we might have A, or we might have B and C. And us human beings have this really beautiful but dangerous ability to fill in those blanks, to infer, to make inferences from what the information we do have, and say, now this is what I would guess A, what did I say, B and C, A, D and E are, that lead me to F. Now, the reason why it's both beautiful and dangerous is it allows us to allows us to learn and say, well, I don't know for sure, but it's within reason that this would be something, this is how I can learn from this. And this is ultimately the pursuit of science, is to really fill in those blanks and say, let us try to understand the best of our ability, truly, deeply, A, B, C, D, E, and F, fully and richly, so that we're not subject to our own biases and our own inferential leaps. Even science, though, is, we'll get this proven eventually, and there's a hidden letter between the two, right? Between C and D. But it's what we try to do. But it's what we try to do with ourselves, and that's why it's important to have collaterals and other people around us that help us with it, because the more eyes on the same situation, typically the better the outcome is, or at least the more astute the observation, particularly when we have people who think differently than us. This is the whole benefit of diversity of people around us. It's like they're going to give us multiple opinions. The other way that we can healthily deal with it is through acceptance. So, not only just have a file drawer of possibilities, like, well, when I went A to F, there were like 3 primary possibilities. So I've got a few options, and if I experience this again, I can take these things out of the file cabinet, see what's up, and flexibly engage it and see if I learn anything new, or maybe if it confirms my suspicions. Great. The other one is acceptance, which is hard to do, but an important skill set to learn, where sometimes things are truly unknowable, and it would be more dangerous for us to infer than simply accept that we're not sure. This is where, religion gets a bad rap a lot these days, but religion really encourages people to practice in many ways acceptance. Now, the detractors of religion would say, well, they encourage acceptance that avoids actually addressing problems. Like, well, the eye of the beholder, and it's who's wielding the religion. But I think they importantly encourage aspects of acceptance that are healthy, if, again, wielded appropriately. So those are the healthier ways of dealing with ambiguity that don't lend itself as much to heavy amounts of distrust and paranoia. What's really challenging is when folks start inferring, like, say, Susie or Bob was over here around the sequence of events that led to F. Well, I'm going to hate Susie or Bob now because they probably had something to do with it, and we anchor in that. Now, we're all prone to this to a certain degree. I say this in my narcissism episode. It's more about the frequency or recurrence of this mindset that creates distrust that lends towards paranoia. Because, doing this once in a while is not the biggest of deals, but if we're always going A to F, A to F, A to F, and we keep saying, like, it's somebody else's problem, there's like these evil entities or forces that are against me, that is what lends itself and pushes people further and further into paranoid entrenchment. Now, all of this is assuming the individual is the only one contributing to this process. The really tricky thing in this world is what happens when people in positions of power and authority, who we project a sense of knowing, that they know something we don't, we project that onto them. What happens when they start colluding with that and saying, you know what, you have every right to be paranoid. You know what, you have every right, as we'll get to be angry. And they feed that. It has a dangerous kind of contagion effect. So it's not just the person in isolation that becomes entrenched. There are other people in society that are saying, you know what, you need to be entrenched. And it can definitely grow and proliferate from that. Because instead of having those people that reality test with us, when we have this kind of groupthink that occurs, paranoia really can grow and can get really rigid. Distrust not just like suspicion and questioning, but floored distrust can take hold and expand and proliferate. And so that sort of repetition is a great way to cope with this anxiety. Like, I don't, A to F, there's so many uncertainties. Well, I have a way to be certain. I have a way to reclaim a sense of control in my life, and that is to believe that it isn't me, but it is the dangerous world, it is dangerous others, it is people or systems that are out to get me are the reason for my distress. They are the reason for this threat, and thereby you focus and project all those energies outward, and that is the seat of paranoia. Now, another way to deal with these anxieties and uncertainties, the world starts to change quite a bit. Usually as human beings, we're pretty patient and pretty resilient. Not all of us, but a lot of us are pretty patient and resilient and go, okay, 1 change, fine. 5 changes, fine. 10 changes, okay, getting a little bit tired. You start asking for 15, 20 changes and people get exhausted. And when people get exhausted, they sometimes get angry. So when they internalize, they might get depressed and anxious and, all sorts of uncomfortable feelings. But a great way to say, like, I'm not going to feel those things is, screw you, screw that, I'm done. You're asking too much and just, become very entitled to be like, no, this is, you are, basically attacking me at this point. Now, I'm not saying that's always wrong, because sometimes we can expect too much out of people, and that is a real thing. But sometimes it's just human nature that when necessary changes are occurring and lots of changes occur, we don't become our best selves, and we start pulling back and engaging in kind of defenses that aren't always conducive for growth, and anger is one of them. Remember, anger is self-preserving. There are times to stand up and be like, I'm not going to do that, right? Like, you're being actually attacked. Like, it is good to be angry and to fight. But there are other times when again, it becomes a projection. Like, you are trying to aggress against me, and the other person is like, or the system is like, what are you talking about? Once again, you get somebody with a megaphone saying, anger, 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 you have every right. It becomes a bit precarious, because then it's the collective mass, and we look for validation often in our lives. We're not necessarily prone to be like, I'm going to look for something that's different. Again, think from a primal standpoint of like, I know what's comfortable over here. It's not like, let me go venture to this village and hope I don't, get killed when I go in there, right? Like, we tend to want to stick to what is known and what is safe. And so we tend to be like, oh, you're paranoid too and distrusting too? Got it. Good. That confirms. So now I'm not alone in this. Or you're angry too? Good. And so that megaphone effect is really, really dangerous. Or it has an effect. Again, we project authority onto people in positions of power. And, even literally a megaphone, someone with a megaphone, we're more likely to listen because there's something that says, like, this person is able to speak greater. Interesting primal parts of our brain. Anyway, now one of the caveats here, and one of the kind of philosophical questions that you might be detecting of like, okay, so fear and anxiety can lead to paranoia. Fear and anxiety can lead to anger. What's the difference between kind of a righteous and just distrust and anger versus a not so righteous version of distrust and anger? To which I would say, touche, excellent question. It's a hard question to answer. Perhaps there's smart philosophers out there that have tried to approach this answer, if there even is an answer. The best I can assert is something I often say, and I think I've said in other episodes about other things, is like anything in the service of kind of an exercising of rights that are not being seen, like equity. Like, these people have these rights, why don't I have these rights? Or you're stripping something away, like a basic fundamental need from me. Again, usually because there's some sort of inequity somewhere else. That's usually more in the realm of a just cause to be more angry. Again, anger has a shelf life. I don't think I said again shelf life, but it has its purpose and its utility. But with distrust, but that's where we get into like meaningful activism. It's okay to be angry sometimes, but you can't be angry 24/7 in an activist mindset, because you're never going to get anything done. But you can use that for good. Whereas when it's about protecting yourself above other people, or there's an impression that because someone else is looking for or claiming something is like inequitable, that and you want to squash that, that's where it gets a little bit more dangerous. Now there are greedy people in this world that want more than you, and they use this as like a trick to get a one up. Like, that's not social justice. Social justice is not trading the hands of power. That's not the point. It's about movement towards equity, remembering that we can never fully get there. But when it's like, I'm going to do me, and there's aggressive others that are trying to take something away from me, even though it's technically in the service for the betterment of society or other people, that's where that distrust and paranoia and anger can get a little bit more dangerous, because people thrash when things are taken away from them. But it's not even anything's being taken away from. It's just you're not going to have as many comforts, or something has been made to be uncomfortable in this moment, but it's for a greater good. That is, I'm sure, an inadequate answer in many ways, because it's still highly subjective, but I think it's the best that I can offer, is that the sort of idea of a communal good, and that approaching, using kind of the language of our forefathers here in the States, is like that more perfect union is important, and it causes disruption, and that disruption will evoke fear, and that disruption will and fear will thereby provoke distrust and anger. But we need to temper it, because sometimes that change is absolutely necessary. But there are other times that anger and paranoia is not to be trusted. It in of itself is simply fear of change, fear of something that's uncomfortable, but at the end of the day doesn't actually threaten you. So that's one way. I, the beholder. Number 2 leads me to the next point, is this idea of collective truths, collective notions of what are we seeking and what are we trying to pursue. Because what those collective truths or zeitgeists say to us is they help us discern. Now, once again, we have had to evolve as a society and as a world, because sometimes our collective truth has been highly flawed and needed to change. But these moments of reapproaching collective truths, of that's the whole beauty of the foundation of the United States, is there are these notions and these values and these rights that we try to suggest, of like that pursuit of liberty and happiness. If it's in the service of that, hopefully that gives us somewhat of a compass. We're heading somewhere due north, right? It's not going to be perfect every time, but something, right? But when we steer away from that, which I feel like we have, now we have a bunch of different encampments who have different versions of what the truth is. And so when you have not just individuals who've gone from a position of fear into distrust, paranoia, and anger, there are some that say, I am entitled. Well, it's not some. Everybody says they're entitled to it. So who's right? Who's wrong? Once again, there's very few rights and wrongs in this world, but I can tell you there are some movements that are more just than others. A good litmus test for this is, what do people in positions of power in those respective groups do in these sorts of situations? Now, what I mean by this is people in positions of power and authority, they are really the pillars of what allow us to say, like, okay, because I have power, I have more sight. Not always correct sight, because we're still subject to our own biases, but I have the ability to talk to more people, enact more changes. I have more positionality to do things that you, as an individual in your busy life, might not be able to do. And with that power comes the responsibility to try to find a gray zone, to try to hear what is collectively being said, and try our best with the help of others, because we're not like these single omnipotent powers as leaders, but try to distill and say, here are these kernels of truth. Here is what we are hearing and seeing that we want to validate and pull and say, like, okay, I can't take everything that you're saying, right? I can't listen to 10,000 people and hear every single individual story, but I can collectively say this is what I'm sensing and feeling. We have to be careful of this ideology, right? That pure, unadulterated anger, that pure, unadulterated paranoia and pervasive distrust. Like, I hear that, but I'm going to temper it and try to move us towards this middle ground. That is someone who's an effective leader. And when you have people like that are leading movements, you can usually trust those movements more because you're noticing that they are, even if the movement itself might sound really bold, you'll notice that they're still trying to temper and find that middle ground, to find a way to say, like, this puzzle piece still fits in this puzzle. I'm not saying erase the puzzle and create a whole new type of puzzle. I'm taking this message and maybe I'm removing a piece of the puzzle, but I'm still going to fashion these pieces so it fits again. And this image still works for us. Those are usually leaders that are to be trusted, that pull us a little bit away from causes that are truly paranoid and purely anger-driven, privilege-driven, whatever you want to call it. Whereas if you look to the leaders, and the leaders are doing nothing but colluding with the energy. These are the snake oil salesmen because they stay in power through a colluding with an extreme point of view. Again, anger and distrust in of themselves aren't extreme, but in excess they can become extreme and they will consume people. And so when you have leaders that are like, yes, distrust it all. Yes, you have every right to be paranoid. And in fact, if you haven't thought of it this way, I'm gonna one-up you and say this is even worse. Or if you have people who say, like, your anger is not just, you're not just entitled to anger. I hear your anger, but, like, I'm going to give you more things to be angry about. And in fact, I'm just going to feed you constantly with things that make sure that you feel aggrieved in this world. Now, this is hard to discern at first because, again, an effective leader will validate and say, like, I hear the anger. You have a right to be angry. Everybody has a right to be angry. But they then start going, how do we distill this? How do we understand this in a way and push for change? And we push, but we push in a way that's effective, that doesn't dismantle everything. I mean, periodically, you do have to dismantle major things. But more often than not, those movements are still gradual because leaders only have so much power and they're just persistent. You know, civil rights movement is a perfect example of this. Like, really, you got to keep pushing because you can't just wait for it to happen. But by and large, you know, Malcolm X versus MLK sort of stuff, like, you know, by and large, though, there is this sort of incremental process of, like, how do we find a way to come together and that make these pieces fit still into the existing puzzle? I want the puzzle to be reimagined. You know, I have a dream, and I'm not burning the entire puzzle and starting over anew. But there are absolutely leaders that will get behind the castle walls of the paranoid and the angry and build this sort of coalition of anger and a coalition of paranoia because it's easy to manipulate. It is easy to manipulate people in positions of fear and anger if you just feed it. Just feed it and constantly feed it. And then they become the people with the power saying, like, I understand your anger. I understand your paranoia because I keep feeding it. And so put me into positions of power. Trust me above all else. I'm not looking for a more perfect union. I'm not looking for a middle ground. I'm looking for anything that keeps you angry. And I'm looking for anything that keeps you paranoid and distrustful. There's no end game in that. There isn't. The end game is like, it's going to be something besides what it is now. I don't know what it is yet, but just trust me. Because you're angry and I'm angry. You're paranoid and distrusting. I'm paranoid and distrusting. Just trust me. Like, effective leaders of meaningful movements are better than that. They're better than that. And so that's the only other way when we talk about this evolution or de-evolution of you know, fear and anxiety into paranoia and anger, is there is the, you know, what's the cause? What, you know, does it sound just? And then there is who is heading the movement. Who is heading the movement? It is a reflection of the movement itself. And there will be good movements that die through this, and won't, the litmus test can fail. I know that. But this is also how bad movements can become good because of an effective leader, and how good movements can become bad with ineffective leaders, because they distort. Bad leaders distort, and they capitalize upon the rawness of it rather than actually doing something useful and constructive with it. So that's kind of the gist. That's how, in my opinion, in using psychology, how we get to where we're at today, is that you have a bunch of people over time that have become increasingly anxious and uncertain about things, and that anxiety and uncertainty built to a point that felt untenable for many, many folks. And very naturally, they become more distrusting and a little bit frustrated. But then, instead of peeling back from that, it amplifies. And that amplification is not just done internally. Again, some people are absolutely responsible for their own sort of place that they are in this. But then when society gloms on and fuels that fire, things become quite unmanageable, and there becomes a dissolution of a central truth. Now, as I mentioned, that dissolution of a central truth could be a good productive thing, or it could be an unproductive thing. And the best that I can offer of how to discern between those two is what are our common morals and values, usually towards equity and trying the best we can to make sure that people have a sense of equal rights and equal access and all those sorts of things. Those are usually relatively just causes. The methods aren't always perfect, let me be very clear. Very debatable of how you go about these things. Versus ones that are more self-preserving, us versus them. Those you have to be a little bit more careful of. But most important of all, especially in this day and age, is who is heading them. What is the mentality and the personality of the people heading these charges? And that can be another important litmus test to understand the difference between a more just and righteous distrust and anger versus a less just and righteous version of distrust, paranoia, and anger that ultimately leads more towards self-destruction than it is actual progress. So if you find yourself in the land of anger or paranoia, I would ask yourself to kind of reflect on those things. Be curious about where you're at and what is motivating you. Be curious about, do you have people in your life and or are the people in positions of power that you have access to elect or to turn to in positions of power? Do they try to find middle ground with you, or do they simply feed the flame? Are they constantly feeding into you're right and everything else is wrong? Be careful if that is true. Whereas if you have more people, I don't know, like, yeah, I know I'm angry, but while you're angry, I try to take perspective, and when I'm angry, you try to take perspective. Okay, it's a healthier way of existing. Whereas if you don't find yourself in a position of anger or paranoia, which is hard to do these days, I find myself quite frustrated quite a bit. Paranoid, I don't know. I got a natural kind of penchant for paranoia, I think, in my life, next to my depressivity and anxiety. But I think overall, probably not paranoid. But if you don't find yourself like entrenched in that, then it's kind of a similar answer. But it's a similar answer insofar as, like, how do we put people in positions of power and authority that aren't just towing the line. You can't give ultimate power and authority to someone who's actively immensely distrustful, paranoid, and angry. It's like a kid is upset and destroying the room. You can't just let them destroy the entire room. You got to go in there at some point. Let them let off a little bit of steam, but at some point you got to do something, right? So I'm not saying like just relinquish and hope these things fizzle out, because it's just not going to, or at least not in a timetable that's healthy for society, especially when it's so widespread right now. So there is this important aspect of, like, how do we get people into positions of power that are good at distilling the essence of something, that they're not delegitimizing. It's an important point I didn't make, is like, you got to be careful of leaders that collude with this energy, but you also got to be careful of ones that absolutely fluidly delegitimize, because there's always kernels of truth. If I'm practicing anything of what I preach, when I think about, like, anxiety and fear is at the core of this, it behooves us to understand what the anxiety and fear is. It doesn't behoove us to shun people, even if they're behaving in paranoid or aggressive ways. It doesn't behoove us to shun them and act as though the status that they're in right now means that they have no valid points anywhere. There's kernels of truth in this. Paranoia and anger launch from a place of rationality, of something tangible, something important that would benefit us to understand and distill and try to understand, even if the outcome isn't quite where we want someone to be. And it's the best way to cure too, to bring people back into the fold. In my clinical world, if I was to go to someone who is very distrustful or paranoid, or someone who's just flooredly angry, it would not be successful for me to go in there and be like, you are incorrect. I will tell you what the correct experience is. You're better now, right? Like, I would fail miserably at my job. Normally what ends up happening is there's validation and trying to hear somebody for where they're at. So it allows us to distill and go, I hear all of this, but I'm going to help you narrow focus here. And is this important? And that usually is what, if anything, can buy people back in to be like, hey, I don't have to be so scared of this world and people who challenge me, because they're willing to see the truth in what I feel and elevate that. But it doesn't mean I have to be all right. It doesn't mean that, to be successful with these people, I don't have to validate literally everything that they give me. It's trying to understand and distill into something more central. And if we have more leaders and people in positions of power, even in informal leadership positions in this world that can do that, we are all the better. We are all the better. Remembering that this is not like toe the line mentality. This is not like coddle people who are actively trying to destroy, or like one of my other episodes say, like actively cut at the net of society. It's not that. It's again, the essence. People who are good at pulling focus and narrowing focus into the essence of something, so that people become less attached to this recurrent paranoia and anger. You distill that essence, it validates enough that people are like, okay, you're listening. You're willing to reflect this back at me, and they will more often let go of this stuff that is actually less important to them and come back into the fold. As far as what you can do individually, that's your own personal compass. I don't blame folks for being very tired these days of getting into these power struggles with folks who are kind of distrusting and just kind of like in their own camps, and they've got their, knives wielded all the time. It's not your job to be like running into blades all the time to try to convince people to back into the fold. But just, hopefully this has been helpful just to think about it more through the lens of fear and anxiety than merely anger or merely paranoia. That there is some truth in there. Is it your job to access it? I don't know. Maybe not. Some circumstances, especially if you've been doing a lot of that, especially if you're in a marginalized population, wherever it is that you live and whatever category that falls under, maybe you're a little bit tired and you got to tap out, but some of us do. Some of us got to figure our way through the knives and the trench with alligators to see like, what's going on, man? Like, why do you have this trench and alligators? And pull people back into society. So I think that's all I got. Complicated episode, very layered, but I feel very important. We are in quite the dilemma. We are in a very precarious state as a society, and fear and anxiety are at the root of that. Fear and anxiety that have, over time, built into overt paranoia and kind of unbridled anger and rage, and it's not a good place for us to be in very long. So that's about it. Thanks so much as ever for listening or viewing, and stay curious.